This video, I'm going to show you how to work on the grid here in Blender. Now, this is extremely useful if you want to create modular assets. And so we're going to be kind of playing around with some architectural elements and do more or less a blockout while working on the grid here in this video. But I'm going to highly recommend you go to the links in the description and download the Machine Tools add-on. It's free. And once you download that, go to your add-ons tab here in your preferences, install it, put check mark in the box, and then you'll have to actually set this thing up and configure it so that it works for you. For this video, I might be using Smart Edge, Smart Vert, Smart Face quite a bit. Probably not too many others, but that's just the tools section. Down here is at the pie menus. I'll be using the Align Pie, Cursor Pie, Transform Pie, Snapping Pie. A couple options I changed real quick. Set Transform preset when setting cursor. I turn that off and I turn this one on above it. Show cursor and selection to the grid. Okay. And show absolute grid snapping. So there we go. Key maps, I redo these real quick because I don't use the modes pie. So if you're ever wondering, I can still hit 1, 2, and 3 and all that for edge and face. And I change these over to Control 1, Control 2, and then Control 3, Control 4, whatever. Right? That's pretty much it. It's really easy to set up. So I do uncheck the modes pie here as well. Once you go through all that, all right, so now if I hit Shift and the back button on my mouse, so if you have the additional buttons on your mouse, you can do this, right? And that's going to be the transform pie. Hit Shift and forward, get to the snapping pie. All right. Shift S now becomes this. And go into edit mode, and I hit Alt A, that's the alignment pie. I might use this, I might not. It depends on what we get into. So, with that in mind, right here, the grid in Blender, by default, you have these 1 meter grid squares. If you zoom out, they turn into 10 meter. Zoom out more, they turn into 100 meter. Okay, there's nothing wrong with working with this. If you were to grab an object, press G, Y, hold Control, you could snap every meter. It's not snapping to the grid though, so if my object was off the grid, I press G and Y and hold Control, it's going to still snap every meter, but it stays off the grid. All right, so one of the things we want to do here is we want to turn on absolute grid snapping. So whatever we have selected, it'll snap to the grid. As I'm orbiting, I'm going to hit Alt, jump into the top view here. We'll see that the top view, it's not just 1 by 1 meter areas, it's a 10 centimeter grid, and it's going to actually snap to that. Okay, so I'm going to hold Control, it'll snap like so. All right, hit Alt Z, I can turn on X-ray so I can see through my objects. And we'll see that actually kind of taking place here. It now snaps to the grid. Even if I had it moved off the grid and I hit G and hold Control, it'll snap back to the grid. Okay, and it's using the origin point for this. However, if you're in edit mode, and I'm going to hit face here and select this face, these also snap to the grid. Like so. Just something to keep in mind if you have a set of objects selected, such as these right here, it's going to use the median point usually. So if I press G and start snapping, you won't see much here in the orthographic view. But if I orbit out real quick, press G, Shift Z, you'll see that it actually snaps off the grid because it's using that median point. So a lot of times you have to switch over to the active element up here. Okay. And so when you switch to active element, you need to define your active element, and that is what will snap to the grid. Okay. So we can keep them all in relation to each other and then just determine which part we want on the grid. Okay. Now this is extremely useful because as you start creating environments, modular environments, props, things like that, a lot of times you need to understand where this object is going to be located in 3D space. So if I bring this floor up real quick, you'll see that the origin point here did not change. But now when we're looking at our object, we can assume that this is a volume cube around the shape of whatever it is we're creating. And a lot of environmental components will actually be seamless or tileable. So it might be tileable in all 3 directions here, X, Y, or Z, or it might just be one. But generally speaking, where this shape occupies space, this is called your footprint. Okay, and so you can pretty much more or less just take a cube like this and say this is going to be a table, right? And you can now assume what the footprint of this shape will be and what you have to work within. It's a little bit kind of abstract right now, but it'll make more sense as you work with this stuff more and more. And so what we're going to do is change the grid size here. Although it's nice to work on a 1 meter grid, and you can certainly move things by hitting Control and Shift, moving it every 10 centimeters. That's something you could do. However, it's a little, come up here, you can change it to 0.1, and it's going to give you those 10 centimeter sections like so. Okay, and this is pretty important if you're a beginner to all this, because most people assume you have to snap to every meter. That's not true. You can go down to 10 centimeter, and you can actually make your origin and pivot points down to this 10 centimeter grid here. And you usually don't want to work less than this, but there are going to be times you might actually venture into that territory. You'll see that in this video a little bit. But let's just go ahead and change the origin point. So when you move in object mode, the origin point stays here, right? And if you go into edit mode, this is just one way you can do it. So you can move things around, and the origin point doesn't move when you're in edit mode. However, using the align or the cursor pie, we can press Shift S, and you'll see we have all this fun stuff here. But one of them is object origin to whatever you have selected. So if I want to move it to this corner, I can just simply press Shift S. And when I do this, I want to hit Alt and hold it, and then click, so that it doesn't adopt the rotational value of that vertex. So if I press N, bring this out, go back to object mode, you'll see that right now our object is set to 0, 0, 0, rotation 1, 1, 1. So we didn't change nothing there. Machine tools will actually align the rotational values to the vertex normals, I believe. So if I was to do that without holding Alt, we'll end up with some weird rotational value here that we probably don't want. So we can always hit Control A, apply rotation, or apply scale. And this is going to be extremely useful, because as you're modeling, you'll run into issues if some of this is set differently. Okay, specifically using the alignment pie, that's something that might pop up. So, all right, that's just one way you can move the origin point around. It doesn't have to just be a single selection. You can select two things, for example, and then place the origin between those two. So if I was to select all three of these, you'll see I can actually move it to that area right there. And that just happens to not line up on the grid, so you probably don't want it there. All right. Other ways of moving this is if you hit Control period, you can actually enable and disable this, and it will allow you to move just the origin point or the pivot point. Okay. You can press Control period to turn that back off. Sometimes you'll have situations where you want this to be offset and empty space a little bit. And that's extremely useful to know, because now you can actually do that. Just not even think about it, right? So that's pretty much the basics of working on the grid itself. So let's put this into practice for a little bit. We're going to start some architectural objects. It's more or less a blockout. At this point, you could actually go and start playing around with things yourself if you wanted, but just hang out for a second. We're going to create a plane. I'm going to change this back to 2 meters. When you change the grid size, for some reason, everything comes in a little bit smaller. But we're going to create a 2 meter. And this is actually pretty good. I'm going to place the pivot point over there in the corner. And so a lot of times on your assets, like walls, floors, you might want pivot points over here on the corner instead of in the middle. And other times you'll actually want it in the middle, for something like a pillar or something like that, right? Certain objects require different placements of that origin point. All right, that's simple enough. Let's create a cube. And we'll go straight into edit mode, side orthographic here. Hit Alt-Z so you can select through the object. I'm going to pull this. Whoop. Did I separate it by accident? I do that sometimes. G and then Y. You don't have to necessarily hit Y, but in orthographic views here, you can snap wherever you need to just by hitting G. One thing I do want to mention real quick is as you zoom in on these orthographic views, you'll see that the grid gets smaller and smaller and smaller, so you can actually snap to these as well. It kind of automatically does it for you. That can kind of mess up your pieces sometimes, so just be careful of that. All right. What we've created here is more or less a basic wall unit that you'll see in 99% of most modular environmental tutorials, and it's just a double-sided wall panel, basically. So this is what confuses a lot of people. If you were to put a loop cut through the middle here, right, and you were to just select one side and delete it, this is a single-sided wall panel. Okay, if we were to delete this here, because this won't actually show up in a game engine, most likely you won't ever see it, so you can actually just delete it. This is your wall panel. It's pre-offset, so it's already 10 centimeters out away from the center plane of the grid here, a 1 meter grid. And so we can hit Control period. We can move this origin point, snap it to that corner. And now we have more or less a basic wall. Okay. We can duplicate this, hit Shift D, hold Control, snap it over. Not a big deal, right? We can start to cut in doors, etc., etc. I'm going to do a control, I'm going to do a loop. So Control R, Control B, do a bevel on it. Change the width type to width. And now you can actually adjust it by size. So we could do like 1.2 meters or something like that. And as great as all that is, being able to adjust it by value there, a lot of times it won't line back up on the grid. In this case, it does. Sometimes you want it to, sometimes you don't. The units you're going to end up using is entirely up to you. So what works for you works for you. You can come up with your own metrics basically, or your own units for your modular pieces. In this case, I want a 2.4 meter high wall here, and I'm going to separate this. Now I'm not going to do this correctly, but normally it's a good idea to measure this out, because if I was to say, I'm going to press E, S, and Y, you'll see I'm using the active element right now. We don't want to do that. Let's switch it back to medium point. E, S, Y, there we go. Even if I hold Control and snap while doing this, it doesn't snap to the grid. It's just kind of a weird thing that happens. So I'm press E, Z, pull this up a little bit. And so we can just press G, Y, hold Control, snap like that. And do things like this super fast. This element here, I forgot to finish the corner apparently. If I press E and just extrude this, and then right click, select that, hit Alt A, align top. That's the alignment tool. It's just, you can quickly make selections and align it all together based on your view. So it's extremely useful. You can see we have a 10 centimeter trim here, but we actually need it to sit over this hole we're going to create for this door. So this is like a door frame. And if we were to go back 10 centimeters this way, it's too thick. And so these kinds of things you just need to keep in mind. For this particular area, what I'm going to do is press S, Y, and then type in 0.5. Just do that number. That's a lot easier in my opinion than trying to fight with it and add up the values here. Okay, so that middle section we can get rid of. All right. We could just pull this one down, I think, for now. Do the same thing here, but on Z, SZ 0.5. There we go. And so this is not on the grid necessarily. Might be a little bit. It is on like a centimeter grid. So this works to create door frames. These are going to be called plugs. And the reason it's called a plug is because the wall is a socket. So you can snap the two together and everything should line up. You won't have any gaps in your surface that'll be noticeable anyways. So I'm going to delete these back faces and the bottom ones. And now we could snap this all the way through, something like that. Okay. There we go. We might want a window. Now for this setup I have going on here, I know for a fact if I do a window, I'm just going to eyeball it real quick, but I'm just going to do a rough bevel. And I want a ceiling tile that drops down a good bit, so I want my window a little bit higher. This is also a good time to put these kind of things on the grid as well. So just keep that in mind. You can snap them real quick. You can see they all line up like so. So this little window section, I'm just going to inset it. Extrude it in on X. Don't use the normal to extrude a lot of times. You'll have to define the axis, so just keep that in mind. We have more or less a window unit now. And you could always work the frames and the bevels on these things however you see fit. Specifically for the door plug, the reason why you do that little bit of offset on each side is so you can bevel things if you need to. And you don't have a little hole that shows up there. Same thing will happen for floors that meet up near the walls and stuff like that. So if you bevel something too much, you might have to create a custom floor piece to fill in that hole. All right. And so we have these done. Cool. Let's go ahead and do a loop cut here. I'm going to grab this face. I'm going to switch to active element using the snap pie. We're going to try to speed it up here a little bit. I want to rotate this 90 degrees like so. It's just holding control while rotating. And you can use that active element of that edge to position it like that. Now we don't have an offset going out this way, so we want to definitely create an offset real quick. Now this is a convex corner. You need a concave corner as well. So you can just duplicate this, go into edit mode, grab this face. We'll just offset it back the other way like this. Okay, and then we'll do this one as well. So we want that 10 centimeters going inwards as well. And so now we have a 10 centimeter section going out, 10 centimeter section going in, but we can't see it because the normals are backwards. So we're gonna grab it, press A, Alt N, and flip normals. Now I didn't mention that, but backface culling is not on by default, so these you can't see any polygons back here. But normally backface culling's off in Blender. So if you run into this issue, you'll find that a lot of times you try to put things into a game engine and it just doesn't look right. That's probably why, because there's not actually two faces here. And unless you set up a shader to do that for your game engine, probably isn't going to happen. All right, and so we can see right there, we're pretty much good to go as far as that's concerned. Let's go ahead and create a plane real quick. Do it like this one here. We're going to go into edit mode. First thing I want to do is I want to pull this one all the way. We're going to just grab the edge here. Okay. We're going to pull this one all the way back to the other one. We're going to press G, Z, hold control, snap it up. It doesn't really matter where you place this yet because you got to set it up on the Z axis to 0.15. All right. And then we're going to press E, Y, hold control. We're going to snap it 30 centimeters out like this. So this is a staircase. That's how high you want it to go up. That's how far you want it to run. So it's going to be 0.15 up, 30 centimeters going out. So 15 centimeters and 30 centimeters. This tends to work out really well, and you're about to see why, but it's quite a simple concept. In theory, in practice, it's a little bit different because sometimes you have different slope stairs. Sometimes you have different wall heights, so they might not be 3 meters high. They might be 4 or 5, whatever. And so you're going to have to find a way of setting up staircases that work. And this is probably one of the most trying things for a beginner. Okay. In this situation, we have 3-meter tall walls, though, right? And at the 0.15 meter increment rise, what's going to end up happening is it'll meet halfway on the wall, and then it will meet back at the top as well. And this gives us a unique chance to create a split staircase if we wanted to. So here we could snap to vertex. We're going to use the active element just because I like to control things a little too much. And so I'm going to make that the active element, that vertex. I'm going to press Shift D, hold control, and snap that vertex to that one. And now I can press Shift R, just start to rise it up to about here. Now this is good for blocking in. However, when you're doing steps with textures and UV maps, you might want to texture each one as you see fit. You might need multiple textures or whatever the case. So, you know, you get to play with that and figure that out later. But for now, we can see we could go halfway here, like I said. So I think we might be off. No, we're good. Okay. And so if we go back in edit mode, let's go ahead and press A, M, merge by distance, go back to object mode. And now we have a half staircase. This is cool because if we wanted to just run this up, we can continue going with vertex snapping. I'm going to go back to closest real quick. And we could just do a snap, maybe. You can see sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. We could snap it, and it can just be a straight run up. However, if we place our origin points exactly where we want them, we'll see right here, we can actually just rotate this 180 degrees, and there we go. So now we have a split staircase, right? Pretty simple. And the floor just happens to line up with all this. And I'm going to turn on these wireframes. It's a good idea to turn this into a shortcut that you can easily get to if you want to use it. Because otherwise you can't see things from the side sometimes in orthographic. And so, but we can see what's going on here. We have this floor panel. I'm going to line it up something like so. We're not grid snapping right now, by the way. So we've got to go back to that. Usually I use the pie menus, but just trying to keep it a little bit more simple. you'll see that it actually snaps right there. It snaps right there, like so. Okay, and this would be the second floor where you could use another floor tile. So ceilings are a little bit more interesting. So what I'm going to do is just pull this up. We're just going to use the floor tile to do this real quick. I want to pull this down with an extrusion. I'm going to inset it, so hit I, and then I'm going to hit E, extrude back up a little bit. And you can see all my normals backward. That's fine. I'm going to press A, Alt N, and flip my normals. Or you could try recalculate outside. And that could be a ceiling tile, right? And it just so happens that the way we did this, we don't have to adjust the rotational values or nothing like that. But it's a little bit interesting where you place the origin points, because sometimes, for example, this ceiling tile, we might want it at the top here, and we might want to place that origin point against the surface it's supposed to align to. So in this case, it would probably align to the floor, or this, and then the ceiling would come down from that. So we can do things like that. Now, you can grab this whole section. I'm going to pull it down so it has a little bit of thickness to it. This is where things can kind of become a runaway train, because now you got to figure out what's going to line up with what and where and how and all that other fun stuff. This might be a little bit too thick. It might not. It depends on what you're creating. So you get to play around with that and figure that out on your own. But you can see for this window, for example, because I put the window down far enough, I don't have to worry about this actually interfering with the window itself. However, if I didn't put the window where it is, and let's say I ran it all the way to the top, right? There's a good odd chance it's going to do something like that, which might not be something you want. So you might want to have a window cut specifically when there's a floor in front of it. Sometimes you might want to run a different panel, like say you got those like big view windows that some nicer houses have, or hotels or whatever. And so they might go like way up here, like a 6-meter tall wall, and they might not have any floor in front of it. So you can just create that as 2 individual sections. You can make those modular too. So you can break them down into 3 components and run them up and run them out. So kind of a lot of different ways to work. Pretty much everything could be modular. Handrails, staircases, windows, door frames. You can break it down into really granular levels and just go crazy with this, right? So just to give you another idea, I'm going to duplicate this wall and go into edit mode. After the duplication, I can bring this down real quick, and we can go ahead and I'm going to actually bump this back. This isn't going to make sense, but it will in a second. I'm going to pull it back forward, pull this down. This is going to be like a baseboard, okay? And we can do this because when we snap this, it needs to snap to every 10 centimeters, right? So this component doesn't have to be placed the same way as the wall. This is what I think trips most people up a lot, because now we can use this anywhere, and as long as we can snap to that grid, it doesn't matter. So we're going to try doing it over here real quick. Maybe we want some like baseboards here, or maybe this is part of like the railing system or something for a staircase, right? And you can see we can easily line these up now. Not a big deal. So we can reuse this in a multitude of different ways. If we had pre-offset this, kind of like we did with the wall, it wouldn't work out real well. And so that's just what happens. All right, all of this is done now for the most part for this video. We're going to just kind of play around with it real quick. And this is what's fun, because I've modeled all of these to line up with each other at meter increments. And I need to fix some of the pivot points probably, but let me do that real quick. Because I did line them all up, we can actually do meter snapping here to line everything up, which is fun. So we can change the grid back. Let's go to a 1. All right, so now when I grab an object, and you can actually just turn on snapping for this. And a little side note, you can also hold shift and select rotation and scale if needed. And so when it comes to actual layout of modular components, a lot of times working with meters is a lot easier than going down to 10 centimeters, but there's still time you're going to need to fluctuate back and forth between them. Just keep that in mind. And so we could take, any wall and just duplicate it. I'm not even going to hold shift and stuff at this point. I could do numbers like this, okay? Oh, one thing we didn't make real quick is a cube, okay? want to just snap it real quick to meter increments here, and I'm going to scale it up on these two axes by let's do two. Oop. Okay, I just did one axis. Okay, that doesn't make sense. Let's do two. There we go. And so pillars. A lot of times you can center align these, and they're great little accent items. Um, so you can toss these around in all kinds of different places. So I just wanted to create that real quick. It's already set up properly for the most part. You might not want to have a face here because you'll see that this tile, this floor tile, might start clipping. You have Z fighting, right? And so sometimes getting rid of things like that can be pretty important. You still might have a little bit of Z fighting right here, but it won't be as bad. If so, you can always create a little bit of a smaller modular system. So you can make this pillar, modular in itself. So you can always cut off like this little top section or something. And so you can play around with these ideas and just go crazy with them. However, so we're laying out some wall units right now. Let's do a corner. Okay, and we might want a door here. Kind of the same thing going on here, right? Make sure we're snapping to the grid. I don't know why it was oh, you know what? Might want to use active element here as well. Just use this one. All right. Because you want to make sure everything is staying on the grid if you're moving groups, and it's something that you might run into. So there we go. Let's reuse this. It's a good idea to leave it alone and just work another area as a little test project. You don't want to get carried away here in Blender if you're going to game engine, because you're going to want to do most of this in the game engine, okay? The layout part. So you can create prefabs and all that fun stuff. You're working in Unity, or can use blueprint actors in Unreal Engine, which is basically the same as a prefab. So now, some corners, you don't necessarily need this piece. You might want to just do something like this. Right, you rotate it 90 degrees, and that's probably a bad example on that side. Let's do this one. Okay, you might have a gap somewhere like this. This is where those pillars come in handy. You can make pieces that cover up certain areas like this, right? I'm gonna move these out of the way real quick, and that's just going to, hide a hole there basically. So you can use mesh to hide things up as well. You can intersect a lot of stuff together. Usually, it's not a big deal, and it just works. So we could do that on the other corner if needed. Just wanted to show it real quick. All right. It's a good idea to sometimes combine floors together so you have multiple panels instead of having one every 2 meters or whatever the case. There's different ways to optimize this kind of stuff later on. So we can see very quickly how powerful this can become because we only have this small selection of mesh, and we could certainly create arches and create all kinds of crazy stuff like churches and whatnot. Now, the way I went about doing this is I created my components first. I knew I was going to want these kinds of walls and things like this. Now, you can certainly just kind of free model objects. So you could just model something you found interesting in a photograph, or model a whole scene from a photograph, kind of the way you would do typical ArcViz type modeling, where you cut out floor plans and then extrude it all up and all that. And then you can break those down later on, find out which pieces work for a modular system, and then go ahead and start cutting them out into the components you need to start lining them up. All right, and it all comes down to working on this grid. And without the grid, you will have an extremely hard time being able to do this kind of stuff. So now, like I said earlier, this is great for any kind of modular asset, right? So this isn't just related to, oh, this is interesting here. This is the ceiling. You don't need that back face there. If we have this back face, what ends up happening is it clips with the floor. All right. And so this works with all kinds of modular assets, though. It could be buildings, architecture, it could be couches, it could be whatever. You name it. Characters, even. Characters are usually based on a rig system, not the grid. So there's also like vertex snapping kits as well. And there's offset plane access, or offset grids as well, which we can't do it here in Blender, I don't think, but in some game engines you can if you have it set up that way. And so what you do is you make like a kit like this, and then you might have one that does some weird angles and stuff on a different grid, and you have to make transition pieces that connect the two together. So it's basically like creating two kits, and then just create transition pieces to work between them. So that's pretty wild. If you want to try something really advanced like that, you're probably going to need some custom tools here in Blender. The way I'm laying these out as well, I want to mention this. I am not laying this out as if it was a production, I'm going to create this to completion, okay? The reason why is because a lot of times it's good to instance things when laying out a modular kit, especially here in Blender, because what's going to end up happening is you'll probably want to modify this wall or fix UV maps or textures or something like that. And if you don't instance these, what's going to end up happening is you're going to have to do every single one or relay it all out. So you want to create instances usually. The only difference is instead of Shift D, right, you're going to do Alt D. Okay, and all that does is check this right here, linked. So now if I go into edit mode, I make a modification to this, you'll see that it modifies both of these at the same time. And that's what you want these ones to do, modify all of these over here at the same time. This is going to get a little bit better here in the next version of Blender that's coming out. It's in beta right now, which is 3.2. And it's going to be able to do asset collections, so then you can actually create walls with multiple components and pieces and then set those up as more or less prefabs here in Blender. And that's going to work out extremely well. And we're going to be able to do a lot of stuff with that real quick. So what I want to do is just go ahead and move these back, and we're pretty much done with this video at this point. There's not much left here to do, actually. So I do want the staircase to line up, right? But you'll see these floor tiles start to not line up over here, okay? And the reason for this, more than likely, is that we could see here, this was a half run, so we get a half tile that we might need right there. A couple different ways you can go about working with that. You could create a half size floor if you wanted, put a loop cut down the middle, delete one side. You could try to readjust your dimensions for your stairs, which can be quite a pain. I think the half size works better up here, personally. We could do that with this one as well. So I can hit. I want to use active element here, and I want to make sure I'm snapping this one to the grid, right? So now we have that going on. Right. So now you would have to finish modeling the stairs, making a modular system that works for you, that kind of lets you put together a multitude of different staircases if you need to, or maybe just a single type of stair in this instance. And you'd probably want to finish the walls and everything else. One thing about the walls is a lot of people, when they're laying out levels in games, they will just invert the scale. Blender does this as well, but usually when you have an object selected, I'm going to duplicate this real quick. If I hit Control M, this is a mirror, and I use the middle mouse click, I can flip it over. But it does invert the scale here. You'll see it turns to a -1. So you can do things like that in Blender here. However, if you were to apply the scale now, it's going to invert the normals. So just be aware of that. You have to flip them back over, and that's something that'll happen. So you could do pretty much whole wall units or whole wall sections like this too. And so it shouldn't be a big deal. Duplicate, Control M, just right click when you duplicate. There you go. Now you got an interior, exterior. You can make a balcony. You can do support pillars for the balcony. You can go crazy with this at this point. So you should be more than competent enough to work on the grid. And you got to do your door plugs here as well. So let's flip that around. So you should be able to create most anything you want on the grid. Just remember, you can work down to 10 centimeters. Sometimes you'll go down in between little weird dimensional areas. You have to figure out what works in your situation. Okay, I can't solve everything for you, but with that in mind, hopefully, after watching this, you now feel a little bit more confident approaching these kinds of situations. Right? It's a lot of fun, and I definitely enjoy showing you how to do this kind of stuff because it's something that gave me a lot of trouble when I was learning it. So now that you know it, hopefully you can accelerate a little bit faster than I did. And hope you enjoyed the video. All right, so take care. Check you out on the next one.